Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to Explained and another music production-oriented episode at that, though I reckon it's been about half a decade since I've touched on this particular topic, as today we will be covering some more tips and tricks for mastering. The last time that we talked about mastering was a more basic overview, things to get you up and going and have the tools that you need to get your music publishable or streamable, or something that's simply shareable with friends in a way that the levels come out consistently, that even if the frequency response isn't necessarily 100% ideal, it's something that is manageable and sounds more like a completed song than just a scratch demo track. For today, we're going to get a couple tiers above in quality, at least I hope to, in comparison to the last time we talked about that. And as such, some of these tools are not going to be free. In fact, I'm fairly certain that only 2 of the plugins that I'll be working with today are free, which is a bit unfortunate. But if you wanted to go through and assemble all of these different elements together, you could do that with freeware. Some of the reasons I'm using these is either they're an industry standard and it was on sale, or because I really like the workflow and some of the things you can do with it, and I'm going to be using it a bunch from here on out, so it was worth the cost to me. Again, though, if you see certain elements of this and think, I don't need that, or I can replicate that with freeware, please feel free. The main issue that I think you may find is one that I found, is that you're simply going to run out of space depending on how your signal chain works out to be, and depending on what program you're working with. So with that, first of all, the lighting and sound situation in this new house is still in flux, so bear with me there. Appreciate your patience. I think I've pretty much got the video looking the way I want it to finally, and the audio is still in flux, which is why I'm holding a wireless lavalier instead of having one clip to my shirt. I cannot get that wired one to work, any wired one to work with my current setup, and this one's sound quality isn't exactly where I want it to be, but hopefully post-production will make it better than the camera audio that I have been using. So hopefully none of that is too distracting and we can get into the main topic at hand. Another issue worth noting, just like the last time that I spoke about my mastering process, I'm going to be using Cubase specifically. It doesn't really matter what you use. Any digital audio workstation's going to work, especially if you're using these kind of plugins, or any plugins, or hell, even analog hardware. If you wanted to feed your audio through there, the rationale, the workflow pretty much is going to be the same. And a lot of the stuff that I'm using is emulating a lot of analog tricks, obviously. But I've seen kind of this resurgence, and I've been pointed to some almost comical examples of the stigma against mastering in anything but insert professional DAW here. I don't get it. I mean, I'm not a professional, obviously. I do my own music production out of my bedroom. So I'm not saying you should treat me as the authority on mixing or mastering or anything like that. The scope of this video is to be able to get, solo producers, or, people that are just getting into music production, people that don't have thousands of dollars to spend, to be able to get their music to a listenable level. And you can absolutely do that in Reaper. You can do that in GarageBand if you really want to pull your hair out, but you can make it happen. And I say all that because ultimately, just like the previous EP, this latest one that I released this year was mixed and mastered in Cubase. Again, it's not, platinum record, $1 million studio quality, but I wasn't shooting for that. And it's not a bottleneck for me. The whole rationale behind me doing this myself is I'm already playing everything. I'm already mixing everything. I'm 100% the producer on this EP in combination with the work that my drummer did. So it doesn't make sense to me to get 90% of the way there and then pay someone exponentially more money for that last 10%, because based off of the AI results that I've heard over the past couple of years, you can get fine results, but I'd rather do it myself. And if I'm putting all this work into crafting this music up to that point, crafting the mixing and getting that sound, then yeah, I mean, if I could do all that, I can do all this too, and so can you. So if you're already at a decent production level, there's no reason that you can't have a crack at mixing and mastering. As I've said before, I'm not trying to win the loudness wars. If anything, I don't want my music to be super peaky or compressed. I want some of the dynamics to come through. I want kind of a late 90s production That's kind of the spot I'm trying to tickle. So everyone's preferences are going to be different, but especially if you're not trying to, again, have the most pristine, polished, contemporary sound, there's no reason you can't do it. And don't let this bullshit point of view that, oh, just because you're not using this particular software, you can't mix or master your music. It's insane. I mean, literally, I'm going to prove it in this video. It may not be industry standard. It may not be oh, you have to do this, that, and the other to get this exact loudness level or this type of transient response or this level of stereo separation. But at the end of the day, this is part of the creative cycle for me. This should represent the kind of music you're trying to make. And again, from a heavy metal point of view specifically, who gives a shit? I mean, we want a little bit of nastiness in our music, I think. It should be coherent. It should be pristine to a certain extent. But I think trying to master this stuff to the same level as a Beyonce song is pointless. That's not what we're going for. So, yeah, as long as it's still aggressive, you can hear what you're trying to hear, and the music's good. What more do you want? But I'm going to hopefully give you a few more tools to compete with, maybe not $1 million studio, but something that you would have paid a lot more money to get one song mastered than buying these kind of plugins on sale and doing it yourself. So with that, let's hop into it. As I alluded to earlier, the sole project we'll be working through in this video is my last EP release, Alatria Calamitous Constructs, and this is literally the EP. As I talked about in the mixing and the recording videos on this, I put every song into one project because the compositions worked out where you didn't have to do anything crazy different between them. The same tones throughout the entire EP. It not only turned into the mixing project as well, but the mastering one, because there's kind of a gray line where the mixing ends and the mastering begins, and you're going to find that the more you work with your own music, I think. But this isn't a workflow I necessarily recommend to people. If you have individual songs, you're trying to get them all to sound the same, that's fine. But I wouldn't do this with 10 songs. It's already kind of a bitch to open, especially with an aging 6-core, 12-thread CPU. And again, it's very heavy on basically any machine, especially because you're going to be bound by single-core performance. So not something I'd recommend. I think you should probably get the mixing stage done first, then go into a separate mastering project. But for me, this just kind of worked out, so I'm not going to change it now. Expanding upon one of those other points for a moment, though, it can be really difficult, especially if you're new to this, to know when mixing is done and mastering needs to begin. Especially if you're like me and you kind of submix all different instruments into their own buses, and then you feed those buses into maybe an overall instrument bus, and then maybe you have a vocal bus, maybe you have an orchestration, keyboard bus, whatever. You can kind of get a lot of that mixing work done then. And then if you end up with, let's say, just make things simple, you've got 4 master tracks that you've printed out, something that's, okay, I've got a drum submix here, I've got a bass guitar and a guitar submix and a vocal submix. Am I done mixing? To me, no. To me, you need to have the overall stereo width set. You need to have the overall dynamics relative between each instrument set. So mastering really begins after all those things are complete. And you could spend literally all day, all month, the entire year tweaking those little things and get different sounds out of it. But a lot of those things can be compensated for in the mastering stage. So for me, when I know mixing is done is when the core of the song sounds the way I want it to, and what I want to attack from that point on is the overall sound. I'm not looking to tame, this vocal is too loud here. You need to fix that in mixing. If this guitar is too far panned this way or too quiet this way, you need to fix that in mixing. If the overall frequency response is maybe a little too dark, but not one instrument is contributing to it, you can probably deal with that in the mastering stage. But if the bass guitar is too thumpy or too pokey in one spot, you need to fix that in mixing. So it really needs to end when the entire song sounds the way it should relative to each individual element. And again, it's kind of hard to know when that is because I emulate a lot of my mixing workflow off of the greats out there who are already mixing into a preliminary compressor, maybe even some multiband compression, some different EQ to try to get an idea of what the individual elements are going to sound like feeding through what is most likely going to be your signal chain with mixing anyway. So it's this constant cycle of iteration, and it's frustrating at first, especially when you're new to this. But again, I think you're pretty much ready for mastering when the song sounds right and the things you're trying to fix is the overall level, not each individual instrument. You're trying to get the overall frequency response right, and you're trying to get the overall dynamic range to sit more with something you would stream off of Spotify or listen off of a CD, if you kids know what that even is. A perfect case in point before I get into my actual mastering signal chain. I essentially have two main buses feeding into the master output here, which is what I'm using for mastering. We have an instrument bus, which has all the submix buses of guitars, bass, drums, all that stuff. They're all mixed the way I want them to relative to one another. They sit in the frequency response pockets I want them to. The dynamic range is all, trimmed up. And we have a master vocal bus, which is basically the same thing. We have all the vocals going into that single bus, and we got the output and everything trimmed once again to where I want it in terms of frequency response and dynamic range. Those two things in parallel, one more pass of EQ or one more pass of compression, gain reduction, whatever it might be, you could say the entire thing is mixed. And in a way, pretty much is. So do you call that the end of mixing? Or do you call that, let's say one more pass of a multiband compressor, now it's mixed. Or one more pass of overall EQ, and maybe we match EQ. Maybe we do, oh shit, we're kind of in mastering territory now. Where does that end? I can't really tell you. But to me, I'm going to treat this entire thing as mastering, since we have basically a complete mix and we're affecting everything. If you recall the mastering basic signal chain from that video, you're probably going to recognize a lot of similar tools being used in this project. And it makes sense because ultimately we're chasing the same goal. But there are a few more sonic tricks we can employ to get even closer to that goal. And I do use the word trick intentionally because some of these things are kind of messing with your ears and even potentially the devices that you're listening to this music through to get the effect that we want here. But at the end of the day, mastering is still trying to accomplish all of those basics just with different tools in the tool bag. You're going to see multiband compression. You're going to see passes of EQ. You're going to see different imaging techniques, and all those things were discussed in the basics video. So as a quick recap, what are we trying to accomplish? Well, we have an overall mix that sounds pretty good in isolation. It's probably not stream ready. It's probably not loudness ready. It's probably not sitting in the correct balance of frequency response that we expect when we listen to similar music. And to get your song to that point, you'll probably not have to only apply static EQ and a broadband compressor, but multiband compression and potentially even different amounts of EQ depending on where you're at in the stereo field. So yes, you will see compression and limiting just like you would in any mixing stage. But for example, I'm using different passes of equalization in a mid-side configuration. This is something that I showed in the basics as well. But for this particular track, I wanted to emphasize and de-emphasize particular frequencies in the middle of the mix where the bass guitar and the kick drum and snare are most present, and wanted to leave some of those adjustments out of the equation for the guitars and some stereo vocals. On the other hand, on the side EQ, we might want to lower some of the frequencies that we want to poke out more in the center of the mix, just to allow for some more stereo separation in the low mids. And maybe I didn't have enough grunt on the guitar chugs, and I wanted to emphasize that around the 200 hertz range. And while you could absolutely make these moves in a mixing stage, it's these sort of fine-tune adjustments, these scalpels, if you will, that I would be more willing to apply at the mastering stage than I would mixing, where mixing, I kind of, especially for this particular project, I kind of want the raw nature of the instruments to poke through a little bit more. Again, it's going to really depend on what kind of mix and master you're going for, but for this workflow, I wanted to keep this kind of stuff in the mastering stage almost exclusively. On the dynamic side of things, you'll probably have a pass, if not multiple passes, of multiband compression like I do here. I'm specifically going after some low end and low mids control that no matter how many times you employ multiband compression or even regular broadband compression at a mixing level, there's probably going to be some range of the frequency response that's just not quite in control yet. And especially the low end is so important to get under control for your mix. You want it to be big, you want it to be solid, but nothing eats up your headroom like low end does. So you can have everything else under control. And if you got a big bass drop, or you got the guitars chugging and the bass guitar going and the kick drums, giving 16th notes for a few bars, there's a good chance that you're going to overwhelm your mix and basically every aspect of it. So while it's important to be able to attack those things in the mixing stage, sometimes even when doing it broadband compression or going after each individual element in parallel, you still might find some examples where it's overwhelming. So while I wouldn't be quite as aggressive with multiband compression in the mastering stage as I would be in the mixing stage, you still are probably going to need it, which is why you're going to see that this signal chain starts with multiband compression. It's kind of an age-old argument as well. Which one comes first? Do you do EQ into compression, or you do compression after EQ? And what's the pros and cons of it? I touched on a bit of my rationale with this in my old video, but in general, I kind of like to view this in terms of blocks where you've got a EQ stage, then you got a compression stage, and another EQ stage, and another compression stage. And those individual stages may be multi-stage within themselves. Like, for instance, after this multiband compressor, we've got a passive EQ, and I've got another EQ match, which is something that Ozone can do that compares your current mix as is, compares another one that you like, and tries to figure out the difference between the two, and then you can dial up the amount that you're matching to that just to get you closer to where you want. And I did employ that in the mastering stage here. But as you see, we're going kind of a dynamics thing back into a static EQ thing, and then we'll go into another dynamics thing, and then we're going to go back into a static EQ thing, then we're going to go into some dynamics things again. And really what you have to think about planning it out long term is, how do I want that next thing to react? So for me, I started with multiband compression because I liked the overall, at that point in the mix, I liked the overall dynamics between each instrument. I liked the dynamics of the mix, but there was just certain areas that I needed to tame. After I tamed that, I realized, well, it's not that I had a bass problem all the time. Obviously that helped, but now that I've solved that, I kind of want to reinforce it across the entire mix. So you can start adding, subtracting frequencies. After that point, you'll hear, okay, now I've got another dynamics issue or something that now that I've controlled this, I can maybe get the dynamic range lower, make it louder all the time, make it more aggressive, and you kind of keep going through that. In general, compressors react very differently when you give them different amounts of frequency content. So chopping off some low end, feed it into a compressor, it's not going to compress as much. So you might have just saved yourself some dynamic range or some work on that compressor by just cutting some low end, and vice versa. If you boost the hell out of it, it's going to be compressed a lot more, having to do a lot more work. So it depends on what you're going for. There are many moves throughout my mastering signal chain that are character driven, that I simply wanted the emulated amplifier circuit of that EQ, of that compressor, of whatever thing I'm using to react a certain way. And that's kind of how you have to think about what you're feeding it frequency response wise. So that's why I always like EQ into compressor, and then into another EQ, and then into another compressor or limiter or whatever dynamic range thing you're doing. I pretty much always accompany it with some amount of static EQ change.
Legislation, decide from its
So at this point, we have a plain Jane Waves multiband compressor. We have one instance of ozone where I'm not even using half of the individual modules I have here. And yet I have another instance of ozone down here that I could have combined with this one and probably saved a lot of real estate processing power. So what's the deal? Well, it was at this point of the mix where I want to introduce one advanced technique with clipping. And this is something that I did not employ on Children of the Stars, mostly because it's a totally different type of mix. And with the orchestral arrangement and the overall clean, happy vibe I was going for, that didn't really fit thematically. But if you're going for a heavy metal mix and even a more poppy hard rock type of mix, you're probably going to want to employ this stage. Just like with some of the other plugins I used on this mix, this is a Submission Audio product, not because I'm sponsored or have any ulterior motives. I simply like this one, but I'm going to be 100% transparent with you. This is a clipper, and you can get this exact phenomenon for completely free. Now, the exact wave shaper they're using, depending on where this control is set to, you may have to play around, 92% on one may not be 92% on here. But when it's set to completely hard clipping, guess what? A hard clipper is a hard clipper. That's it. It doesn't matter how pretty the interface is. If you have a free hard clipper and that's all you want, that's all you need. You do not need to spend the money on this thing. I found, though, for my use cases, 92%, which is just a little smidge of soft clipping introduced, was kind of where I wanted it at. Because essentially what you're doing here, just like with a guitar pedal, is you're clipping off the tops of your input signal, depending on where this threshold is set. Now, I have the threshold set at about -1.35, and that's all going to be dependent on what you have feeding into this thing. Just like with mixing and everything else that we've talked about, gain staging is important. So, you want to leave yourself a little bit of headroom between each stage. But the reason we're doing this is because we're raising the perceived loudness while also having this weird knock-on effect that kind of, in another way, makes the perceived dynamic range higher. So essentially what you're doing is kind of like the tube amplifier trick. A lot of people go, well, 100 watts out of a solid state amplifier is just so quiet. I mean, it's loud, but it's not nearly as loud as a 100 watt tube amplifier, even though the wattage is the same. So tube watts are louder than solid state watts. No, not necessarily. And factually incorrect, in fact. The reason a 100 watt Marshall sounds way louder than a 100 watt Randall is, especially in the power amp section, by the time you're cranking it that loud, all those individual elements are starting to clip, and probably clip to shit at that point. And what happens when a signal is clipped off, if you have sinusoidal wave doing this and you raise it to the threshold of the circuit, when it's clipped off, you introduce more harmonics due to that clipping nature, but you're also more of the time at the loudest point that you can be at. Of course, too loud, things start sounding mushy, but the persistence of that signal makes it sound like you've gone even past the physical threshold for how loud that thing can be. And that's essentially what we're doing with Flatline or any clipper in a mastering use case. We're essentially stretching out every peak and trough of the input signal. And for the ones that are going to go over the threshold, well, they just get clipped off. And this is different than a compressor where the dynamic range is also, by the kind of same logic, by the same math, decreased. You can make the whole thing louder, or realistically what you're doing is you're making the whole thing squished together, decreasing the differences between the peaks and trough and then making up for it later. But we're doing this in a not clean way, right? A compression circuit without any analog bits in it should be completely clean. It is a 100% dynamic range operation. But for this, we can introduce some harmonics. We can introduce a little bit of grit and dirt. But weirdly enough, on the output of all of this, obviously we're working in a completely digital workstation right now. But what this is trying to emulate is a trick that a lot of 2000s producers would use, where you would go through a digital to analog converter and it would clip that converter. And when played into a speaker, when this is your final mastering stage, you actually get a little bit of pop and a little bit of click and a little bit of overshoot in the speaker that plays this signal. So if you have a big kick or snare signal that is setting this off, and I'm trying to make this to where that's almost exclusively what sets this clipper off, it kind of makes the overall song louder, at least to our ears. It kind of makes it to where the speakers are seemingly working harder than they should at that volume level, because there's no such thing as a perfect square wave in the analog world, right? So instead of flat, you're going to have kind of this impulse response, kind of this overshoot, undershoot thing. And that sounds really pleasant. It sounds aggressive. It sounds really cool for this kind of music. So I think you kind of need something that does this in an output mix, but you don't want to overdo it, because then you're clipping off everything. And then when everything's loud, nothing is loud. And that's the the loudness wars that you have to fight on your own. After that, I implemented another gentle pass of analog emulated EQ, partially to get some more analog circuitry flavor in there, which is the next major segment that we'll talk about. But also because when you clip things and you start introducing some type of distortion circuit into your track, you'll realize there's more room that you can adjust things when it comes to EQ and the static frequency response. So again, that's kind of why I like to go dynamic range EQ, dynamic range EQ, dynamic range EQ, and this was yet another one of those passes. The next block I have could have theoretically been placed at the beginning of this entire signal chain. Hell, you could do it in mixing if you want. And there are some similar operations that I've done to vocals and guitars in my own mix chain. But it really depends on how you want it to interact with other multi-band operations like the multi-band compressor or stereo, mid-side equalization. So it's at this point that I introduce imaging. This is something I touched on briefly in the Mastering Basics video, but in that one I focused almost entirely on the low end, whereas in this implementation, we have different bands to play with. So the idea kind of stemmed from this funny quirk of vinyl where it doesn't really like stereo bass that much. So in the vinyl mastering process, a lot of engineers would sum the bass together where, even if there was just hints of stereo width to a bass guitar or drums or whatever was recorded, a lot of stuff, you're going to have a lot more microphone bleed when you're doing stuff with real gear and not in the box like we are a lot of the times. They would take a lot of stuff, let's say 200 hertz and below, or maybe more conservatively 120 hertz and below, and just sum it together and just make one mono channel out of it. And that's kind of what you can emulate, and that's what I wanted to emulate with Children of the Stars, to try to get some of that orchestral width narrowed down just to be more digestible. With this, where everything is already kind of center channel, I didn't want to go too crazy on the bass, on the kick drum, but I did want to control some of those aspects as well as widen out some other ones. So with the Ozone Imager, you can define different frequency bands. I have crossovers at 92 hertz, so band one's that and below. Another one at 349 hertz, and the last one at 5.1K hertz, so everything 5100 hertz and above is band 4. And for each individual band, not only can you solo them and listen to them, obviously to see what your effects are doing, but you can change the amount of stereo width on each one of them. And you can, if you wanted to, make one huge band out of it and change the entire stereo width of the whole track. But for me, what I wanted to do was just a little bit of summing of that low end at 92 hertz and below. Again, this is well below a lot of fundamentals, a lot of what the guitar is doing. This is basically just kick and bass guitar, and where I had the tri-amp set up, it's really only the low end of the bass guitar and maybe some of those sub drops. In the mid band, I wanted to leave this basically completely alone. I liked what was happening there. With the higher mids band, we're starting to attack stuff like the vocals, the guitars, the toms, even some of the lower tuned cymbals are affected. And this is where I really wanted to start gluing those individual elements in the stereo spectrum, because you can do a lot of this stuff individually, and I did in the mixing stage. But the name of the game with mixing and mastering is you want that whole track to glue together, and everything to have its own pocket of space, but to really sound cohesive. And blending in different amounts of stereo width depending on the frequency response really helps with that phenomenon to me, because now you've got more separation than you could ever have in any other means with the bass guitar and the kick versus the guitars versus the cymbals and the vocals, which are primarily, the cymbals especially, they're going to be even further outside. Again, you can do this at the mixing stage for the cymbals, but because there's some bleed, there's some other stuff going on in that high end, like the guitars, you just get this almost like an effect that you have 4 or 5 speakers in front of you and the subs in the middle, and then you've got smaller speakers further away. That's kind of the phenomenon that I'm going for. And it really works to keep things clear, especially in a mix like this that is so busy and it's just big, but it still gives an opportunity for things to have their own pocket. So imaging is huge, and I think it's something that you should try, but a little bit goes a long way, so you don't have to go crazy. After imaging, I added in another multi-band dynamics operation, this time in the form of dynamic EQ instead of compression, because from this you can set the threshold to be a little bit more sensitive and only add or subtract gain when absolutely necessary. And I thought this was really important after the imaging, because now you kind of have a more clear, in some instances, of impact on which parts you're actually operating on when you're adding gain to, say, all these sub frequencies. So this is another very subtle step, but what you're going to see that I've stacked up multiple times by now, and I'm going to continue stacking up, is analog vintage tape, and an exciter that I can use an analog if I wanted to model, but there's a retro model, there's tube tape, warm, whatever. And the central theme behind all of this is, even if I'm doing just a pass of dynamic EQ, even if I'm doing just a compression pass, what we're building up towards is an overall level of saturation due to those analog circuit elements that you don't get with one pass of a tape or tube emulator. And you also obviously don't get it if you have none of those emulations happening. So if you're just going through clean compression, clean EQ, that's fine. It'll still do the job. But especially for what I would call this kind of organic mix, where we're using real tube amps, we're using real drums, we're using, a real transistor-based pedals, all that going through cab IRs, I wanted to kind of add a little bit more of that analog secret sauce where I could. Obviously, this is modeling, but for aggressive music like this, it sounds kind of cold if there's nothing happening. If you just have the raw output, sounds good, sounds clean. I mean, all my demos and the things that you've heard in the previous video series with all this stuff turned off, it still sounds like it should. But to get all of it to gel together, I feel like putting it through some cascading analog circuits that are still mostly clean, but every analog circuit has just a little bit of dirt and a little bit of noise floor on it. Hence why you can see all my levels flickering all the time. It really helps make it more convincing and make it sound kind of classic the way I wanted it to. Obviously, like I said, I'm not shooting for any records in the loudness wars. I wanted this to be almost Bob Rock levels of 1990s Metallica production. I didn't want this to be the most in your face thing ever. So stacking all those things up really helped with some of the believability. top of potentially adding some quote-unquote analog warmth to your mastering session, Ozone also lets you manipulate the sidechain input on the compression step. And you can do this in multiple ways in mixing and mastering, but this makes it really easy, where this is not an EQ curve that you're hearing, but it's the EQ curve that the compressor is reacting to, meaning this one is going to be more sensitive to frequencies at 2.4 kilohertz and less sensitive to those that are 100 hertz and below. Basically, I'm kind of like where the bass was at this point, and I really just want it to react to the overall mix more when there's more mid content going on. So it's still affecting the whole mix, which is different than you would get out of a multi-band compressor, but it only reacts when it needs to, and there's too much mids happening. And you could, make this happen for anything. You have a sharp and smooth and balanced mode. For this one, I wasn't going for necessarily a character-driven sound. I didn't care as much about the analog or the amplifier circuitry emulation side of things. This was purely a dynamics decision. Skipping over the subsequent block for just a moment to stay on the topic of dynamic range, this exciter block at the end is trying to emulate a little bit more of that console flavor. Fortunately, with the oversampling option, this gives you ample opportunity to get some more believable harmonics out of this thing. There are other modes as well: tube, tape, retro, warm, triode, as I talked about earlier. But for this one, just some subtle changes to the high frequencies. I've got roughly 5 kilohertz and above being affected. And this is important because if you start really sharpening and adding a lot of harmonics to the low end, it can sound like mush. So for this one, I'm really trying to saturate a different frequency response range in kind of a multiband way. You kind of think about this as a light multiband distortion operation than if you just added, a big passive tape or something over top of it. And that's where we get into kind of this interlocking relationship between dynamics and saturation, because they're kind of two sides of the same coin, or at least they can end up with a similar result. So with clipping, it is essentially kind of an on-off switch. I mean, obviously it's going to affect the mix differently depending on how much the threshold is set to, how much of the signal is shooting over that threshold. But it's going to work the same way kind of every time. With something like an exciter here, especially a multiband one, or the vintage tape, or this more is more step I have from Auto Audio, these are things that are a little more subtle. And again, I'm trying to stack up all of these analog flavored elements like I've been talking about to get something that fills in those harmonic gaps, that makes it sound more complex, that makes it sound like it's not just the sound of the instrument, it's not just the sound of the amplifier, but now we've got what kind of sounds like preamp saturation in here. We've got kind of an analog console style thing in here. And that's something that I was not really shooting for in my previous master. But for this one, again, with the theme of the tones going on in the album, I think it's a really good fit. For instance, with that exciter stage, I have the mix and amount dialed in so low that it's just kind of acting as a subtle fill in the gap stage, do things that the other plugins weren't doing that I kind of wanted them to. So this is as much of an augmentation, a very subtle thing that you probably wouldn't miss that much if I got rid of it. But with something like a tape emulation, that is kind of emulating the full mastering process, and something that we heard on every single recording for basically ever until the invention of the digital audio workstation. So for this, I didn't want to go overboard because I'm doing a lot of other analog stuff anyway, and I wanted it to have that hi-fi result with just maybe a little bit of warble and a little bit of wrongness introduced. So not going crazy low on the tape speed or anything like that. We've got 30 inches per second emulated, and just playing with the harmonics and some of the emphasis to get it to do the thing that I wanted it to do when it comes to tape emulation. Again, at this point, we're talking saturation. We're talking sprinkling in harmonics. We're not talking about slamming the mix to sound like, a complete muddy, grainy mess. This is the sprinkles of confetti on top of the cupcake at this point. I could very well have left it at that, or completely nuked most of those steps and replaced it with this Auto Audio More is More plugin. Really like this one. I'm probably going to use this on basically everything from now on, because a lot of these tricks are available here. And this is kind of an overall mix mastering saturator. And it sounds good on a lot of things. There's quite a few interesting presets depending on your application. But this, I've got it to be very subtle because I'm doing most of that stuff here. But if you wanted to, you could add a clipping stage here. You can mix it in or mix it out. You know, I would never recommend 100% on this kind of stuff. I'm not doing 100% on any of this, especially when you're cascading them into one another like I am. And you've got different types of clipping and output that you can make the entire mix louder. And when it says louder, it's not just increase the level, it's decrease the dynamic range as well, seemingly. So saturation is one of those things that you could do forever. You could do it in one step if that's all you wanted. But for me, it's spreading out the work among many circuits that makes it believable, because that's how things used to be, right? I mean, it's all about signal to noise ratio. All these mixing and mastering engineers, they were not trying to overload a console. They were not trying to make things turn red. You know, maybe you have a band that comes in and goes, fuck it, let's see what happens when we make that little gauge turn red, and you get cool sounds out of it. So it's knowing when to push things a little further than they were designed for, and it's knowing when to keep things kind of in a manageable range. That way, the knock-on effects of stacking all these things on top of each other, like an analog EQ, an analog compressor, an analog saturator, a clipper, all these things, the end result sounds harmonically complex and pleasing. point, you're almost at the home stretch. You've manipulated the frequency response of your mix. You've manipulated the dynamic range to get things more tame, to get things bigger where you want them to be, but more consistent across the entire song so it doesn't sound weird and you're not fiddling with a stereo when you play it back. But guess what saturation and clipping does? It actually, without makeup gain at least, lowers the overall output, just like dynamic range manipulation like compression or limiting does without makeup gain. So you're probably left, unless you're making up for it in individual stages, which is good practice if you can make it work, you're probably left with a quieter master in a lot of ways than what you had potentially started with the mix. Again, I recommend, kind of taming it throughout each individual operation. So that's where we need to get back into, once again, a final pass of dynamic range manipulation. This is something that I covered in the basics because this is a basic step. Limiting, aka compression with basically the infinity to 1 ratio, is what you'll need to get your track back up to the listening levels that we expect. It's one of those things where, just like with regular compression, I prefer to spread out the work among multiple limiters. I think it sounds better. It sounds a bit more natural to my ears, and it tends to handle some of those edge cases better. Let's say 99% of your mix is within this range, but then you might have one little spike there that all these operations didn't catch. It just sounds less quacky, less flappy to me. I can't really describe that in a better way. If multiple limiters kind of smooth that out than just having one, duck it really quickly. Unfortunately for this, I was basically only left with the slots for a single limiter and a brick wall limiter, but I didn't really feel I needed another one, so I could have, chain those together in a different way to get more if I needed. But it's at this stage where you're pretty much going to want to slam the output. And I don't mean again, I'm not going for loudness wars here. We're trying to get the level back up to what it should have been after all of these steps. And again, doing all of this, we've decreased the dynamic range. So I'm not really looking to kill the dynamic range once again. We just want to get it back up to limited and listenable levels. So for this, I've got an out ceiling of -1. That's, with no other work, basically going to determine how loud this thing is allowed to get. So I'm not going for 0.0. I never do. I'm not even going for -0.1. Most of the time, my masters are roughly in this range. Couple that with the fact that I have a more dynamic master and mix than what you're going to hear on most streaming. My stuff's quieter. It is. And I'm okay with that. Again, I would rather my stuff be in the similar sonic ballpark of Black Album and Rust in Peace in terms of how loud it is through your stereo than a contemporary, crushed pop metal band. That's just my opinion. So you can basically do all this stuff the same and just adjust your out ceiling here, adjust the threshold on your brick wall limiter, and you can get it up to 0.0. It's pretty much as simple as that. But in my experience, is also much easier and much more forgiving to make things sound good when you're not pushing those things. And that is something that, I realize my workflow, my entire concept, the image, the sonic imprint I have in my head for this EP, it would not have worked if I just did everything you just shown and slammed everything to 0. It would work in the technical sense, but the things wouldn't sound right. And I specifically wanted to have a little bit more life and a little bit more movement in, the drum set, in the guitars and all that stuff. So you can do that. You can do everything you just saw. The steps are basically going to be the same, but you have to start really tweaking to pull in what I feel is those last 0.5 dB to get it to, the loudness wars level of polish. Again, we're heavy metal, in my opinion. It shouldn't be 100% polished anyway. But to wrap this all up, yes, you're going to need at least one passive limiting and a brick wall limiter to make sure nothing escapes out of that threshold that you want your end master to come out to. And with all of that, you should have a pretty advanced sound.
Decide from its
And that's going to do it for today's episode of Explained. Again, the intention of this video is for you to get up and running and making a more convincing and more professional sounding master. It is not to fight in the loudness wars. It is not to compete with $1 million studios or a how-to be a mastering engineer or anything like that. I'm not a pro with this. This is simply some of the things I've learned from my own tutorial watching, my own reading. I cannot recommend the systematic mixing guide enough. There is so much valuable information in there. It is infinitely more valuable than just the mixing and mastering part of it. But as that literature kind of goes into, this is very much a bottom-up process. The better you get at getting a good source tone and capturing what you want, at making things clean and making the right decisions in the right spot, you're going to get a better mix, a quicker mix. You're going to get a better master at the end. The whole thing is more than the sum of its parts, and it just takes time and practice to get there. I'm not perfect at it by any means, but what I'm ultimately trying to get at is don't let that be a deterrent to get your music out there. Because I do, again, see a lot of sentiments like, well, I got to pay this guy because I have no clue how to do it. If you can, learn an instrument, if you can operate, a DAW, there's no reason you can't do this. It may not be great at first, but give it a shot, because if that's what's preventing your semi-pro band or a professional band from, putting your music out, the hell with that. Like I showed you, you can about throw this stuff into an AI mastering process now, or use any of the multitudes of ozone presets and get a really convincing sound right off the bat that is competitive. That's like, you hear that and go, yeah, it's probably not perfect, but yeah, sounds good. I'd listen to it, and it's not the bottleneck. So, give it a shot. And like I said, I'm no pro with this. I'd never intend to be, but I kind of want to do it all myself, and I'd rather get there slowly and, in the long run, save God knows how much money if I put out 50 songs, then say I've never tried. So if there's any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. Though to answer one potential one, no, I don't master other people's stuff. At least I never have, and I don't intend to start. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff I do that I don't recommend. It's kind of a do as I say, do as I do type of thing. But if there are other questions, you know where to put them. We'll see you next time. Bye.